V drugem polčasu uvodnega dela konference bomo najprej nadaljevali razpravo o gospodarskih priložnostih, ki jih prinaša koncept krožnega gospodarstva. Z boljšim ekodizajnom, boljšim ravnanjem z odpadki ter s ponovno uporabo materialov in proizvodov lahko podjetja v EU privarčujejo do 600 milijard evrov in EU pridobi 2 milijona novih delovnih mest, so izračunali v Bruslju. Od komisarja za okolje smo prej slišali, da lahko le z izvajanjem obstoječe zakonodaje na področju odpadkov ustvarimo več kot 400 tisoč delovnih mest in povečamo letni promet sektorja odpadkov za več kot 4,2 milijarde evrov do leta 2020. A so te številke realistične? Več o učinkih izboljšanega upravljanja z odpadki na zaposlovanje nam bo povedal ustanovitelj in predsednik svetovalnega in raziskovalnega podjetja Eunomia, Dominic Hogg. Izvolite, gospod Hogg.
I'd like to start by thanking the organisers for inviting me here and giving me an opportunity to present, and also to congratulate you on bringing together such a wonderful group of people and so many people, and I think that's testimony to the interest that now lies in this subject. So I've entitled this The Employment Effects of Improved Management of Waste, and I've put that word in inverted commas. For a long time, I remember back in 2000 we wanted to write the draft waste strategy for Wales without using the term waste. And it remains a problematic term because it's not just the term that's problematic, because of course it has legal connotations, because various things have to be done or don't have to be done when material is defined or not defined as waste. And I suppose part of what we're looking at in the circular economy concept is moving away from thinking in terms of waste. And I particularly like the concept used by Ellen MacArthur of leakage that defines anything that goes either to landfill or incineration as something that we've lost. And that's very, very strongly chimes with our own view. I come from a city, by the way, that's Bristol in the west of England. So greetings from this year's European Green Capital to Ljubljana, which is next year. So I hope you go from strength to strength in that year. It's worth reminding ourselves of where we've come from over the last few years and months. This figure shows, it goes on the left-hand side from the year 2006 and on the right-hand side to 2015. Anything above the line is an increase in unemployment from 1 month to the next. And anything below the line is a reduction in unemployment from 1 month to the next. And you can see that period after the onset of the economic crisis in the second half of 2008, we saw these large numbers of people entering or exiting the labour market. And if you look at all the numbers above the line, I think it's pretty easy to see that we haven't recovered the situation to that pre-crisis level yet. We're on our way. We're doing better in 2014 and 15 than we were. And we have some staggeringly high unemployment rates, particularly in Greece and Spain. And we have actually a tale of not inconsiderable woe, I would say, particularly where we're talking about the levels of youth unemployment, which, depending upon how you define it, are as high as 50% or so in Spain. And that's a challenge. I work for a company, and we're lucky to be taking people on. And it's the best thing, if you run a business, to be taking on new employees. What's quite disenchanting is when you get 400 applicants for one job, and you look at what is actually a heap of human talent that's going to waste. And I think that's a really important message for our economies. And these unemployment rates, the blue bar, I think it's blue, I'm sorry, I'm colorblind, it's good enough. The blue bar indicates the people who've been out of work for more than a year. And so you can see that this graphic tells us that we've got a large number of people who've been out of work for a long time. And it feels to me that that's something we need to be cognizant of. So what I want to do is sort of skip through some analyses of what we might be able to do in terms of jobs through. I'll touch on some of the more sort of new business models later on in the presentation, but I'm going to concentrate initially on, shall we say, the what now seems a slightly boring waste bit, but nonetheless important, because we've still got a very long way to go in improving that in various different places. Not least, it has to be said, in Greece and Spain. So there are a number of ways that people go about doing this. Typically, you have bottom-up approaches where people try to look at the employment intensity of different activities, and they say, okay, so if we're going from one level to another in terms of in terms of recycling, what does that mean? We've got an increase in the number of people who are being employed in recycling, but we've also got, relative to the counterfactual, we've got a reduction in the number of people who are employed in the disposal area. And this is a study from the United States, and it tells us basically that we've got some pretty high levels of reuse pretty high levels of employment generation for reuse activities. And then if we drop down, we've got into the the recycling-based industries. And within the recycling-based industries, we've got quite a lot of variation between the pretty capital-intense paper mills and the much more labor-intense plastic mills, particularly bearing in mind that this is jobs per 10,000 tons of material. And then you've got conventional sorting facilities, composting, and then the sort of disposal-type treatments. These figures, we can argue exactly where they should be, but they're broadly consistent with what you see in a lot of the literature. So we see here that we've got, as well as a sort of conventional waste hierarchy which tries to define what we should be doing in terms of order of preference on environmental grounds, that as well as the pretty well-established fact that as we go up that hierarchy, it's not universally true across all the materials, but we've got carbon savings improving as we move up the hierarchy, but we've also got the employment intensity increasing as we go up that hierarchy also. And I think that's an important message, because it says, well, look, there are a number of reasons why we will try to pursue better management of these materials. One of the first times we tried to approach this, it was in the very early days of UK recycling. And this was a study we did for the Waste and Resources Action Programme back in 2002. And we used 2001 data. And what we wanted to show, quite interestingly, was how many jobs were already being generated by the recycling and reuse economy. And this was a time, bear in mind, when our municipal waste recycling rate in the UK was somewhere around 10%. It was very low indeed. So we were trying, if you like, to establish one of the platforms for why we would go forward and do more in this area. And this showed us that we had approximately 109,000 people employed in the industry at the time in the UK, around 0.4% of the employment, 2% of GDP. Not insignificant. And that didn't include indirect effects. So when we employ people who are employed, they spend money, that generates economic activity elsewhere, and so there's an indirect impact of that spending. And those multipliers in the recycling industry, some estimates have them as low as 1.2, 1.3, but most of the estimates are closer to 2. So you can almost double the number of jobs that are generated through the employment when you factor in the indirect effects. So in our case, we used a figure of, I think it was 2.2 for the multiplier, which came from a US study at the time. It was the best figure we had. And so we estimated that overall we'd have 240,000 people employed in this area. And we'd barely started. We hadn't started. We were trying to persuade the government to do something. And the irony was that, we could already identify that there were things going on. And the European Environment Agency undertook a study recently where they did the top-down approach. They looked at what was the employment in different SIC codes, and they tried to extract from that the number of people that were being employed directly in recycling. And they expressed this in terms of the number of persons per million inhabitants. So you can see that they were suggesting that there was an increase in employment both in the wholesaling of waste and scraps and in recycling. And the total is rising from somewhere around 400 per million inhabitants to 600 in the period 2000-2007. So a 50% increase in 6 years. And we've got very good reason, of course, on the basis of the statistics at our disposal, that this figure is continuing to rise. Now, in 2011, Friends of the Earth, looking to influence what was going on in the European Commission around the package, around, at the time, it was more to do with the roadmap to a resource-efficient Europe. And they were looking at what might happen if you went forward to a 70% recycling rate across all materials in the period from 2006 to 2020. And you can see this figure rockets up. This is actually in thousands of jobs. So you've got a rocketing up from around 1,300, 1.3 million, to 3.3 million in the period. Now, I want to come back to this graphic because I think there's something that isn't demonstrated through this graphic, which I think we have to be very aware of when we're trying to understand how many jobs we generate in the EU here. But you can see that there's a significant escalation in the number of jobs that they're saying would be generated. Their baseline was 2006. They said that the direct jobs for the EU as a whole, we had 321,725, and the total jobs was more like 560,000. And their multipliers, we used what we call type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is effectively the more direct indirect effect, which is the supply chain effect of these industries, and type 2 takes into account all of the indirect effects from all of the economic activity that's being stimulated. Just bear in mind the ballpark figure of 300,000, 500,000 for direct, indirect. The European Environment Bureau then built on this work, and they went a bit further. It's quite interesting, because they looked at a number of different scenarios. You can see the modest, medium, and ambitious scenarios. And they looked not only at the recycling rates that might be considered under that scenario, but they also looked at reuse rates for some of those materials that are most likely to be reused or most commonly reused at the moment. Furniture and textiles. Interestingly, not which I think would have been another very clear one to have included. And if you remember back to the graphic I showed in the employment intensities, what was at the top? It was reuse of So we've got an intensity of reuse there that's really significant. But if you look at the ambitious case that they're looking at, you've got another 300,000 jobs being generated from reuse over and above those generated from recycling. So again, a really significant impact associated with these packages. They used the same multipliers. It was based on the previous study. And they argued that actually we could address 1/6 of youth unemployment in the whole of Europe. Going back to the points I made at the beginning, this is a really worrying issue for many countries in terms of the level of unemployment in the young. Now, we were discussing whether the figures that have come out at various different times in the European, from the European Commission, how accurate they might be. We ourselves have been involved in looking at the costs and the benefits of the legislative side of the package in the circular economy package. So that's mainly the waste type elements on behalf of the European Commission DG Environment. And we've developed what's called a reference model for municipal waste, which we're in the process of transferring to the European Environment Agency. And you have to understand that the modelling we were trying to do, we had two steps effectively. We said, okay, where are we today? And today was 2012 at the last count. What happens when we go from where we are today to full implementation of the existing European law? So that's one step. And then we looked at the impact of the proposed legislative package over and above that full implementation scenario. And what we found was that we had, in terms of direct jobs, going from the total to the Commission's preferred option. So this was principally around 70% recycling of municipal waste and 80% recycling of packaging waste. And we found that we had around 215,000 full-time equivalents generated. If we include a multiplier at 1.75, for the sake of argument, that takes us to just under 400,000 full-time equivalents across the whole of Europe. So this is excluding the reuse element, which we might want to consider. Compare it with the other figures. Why are they so different? They're not that different. The baselines are very different. One starts from 2006, one starts from 2012. So there's less progress that we have to make, less scope for additional employment in terms of moving forward the package. So ballpark figures seem to be about right. Reuse, though, is where I think we should be very interested at the moment in terms of employment. This is a study from Scotland. It was commissioned for Zero Waste Scotland in 2013. And it was looking at what would happen if you just increased the reuse from current levels by various different parameters. And, you know, Scotland's not a huge country, so an additional 3,000 employed in the sector as a consequence of 25% of the additional reuse potential is not a trivial number of people being employed. And so there's clear potential through reuse to generate additional jobs, and I think, you know, this is only looking at 25% of what was identified as the additional potential. So, Albin, this is after Albin's Walford slide. This is the second time today you've seen an hourglass figure. This is a famous turtle. Some of you may have seen it before. It's Mae West, the turtle. When Mae West was young, she swam into a bottle top, one of those things that goes around the top of a milk bottle, and that's what's happened to that turtle. We think marine litter is a major issue for the 21st century. It's not going away. Going back to Albin's points, we've been trying to talk to the cosmetics industry about how much of their products are ending up in the marine environment and as sort of microbeads. And we've got some real problems there. One of the instruments we can use to address that is deposit refunds. One of them. It's not the only one, but it's an interesting one. And we've got all sorts of areas where deposit refunds actually also can generate jobs, whether it's in the logistics, in the counting centres, and in the sorting and so forth. Whoops, just go back. So what we looked at was how many jobs would be generated and lost as a consequence of moving to a deposit refund system in the UK, going from modelling this, first of all, for an 80% return rate and then for a 90% return rate. And this, again, is interesting because what you find is that we get significant job creation in the deposit refund system. You lose some jobs in the existing system, the existing recycling system, the existing refuse collection system, even the existing litter cleanup system. We lose some. And then we have a net position, which is the, can I point with this? No, yeah. This bar here is the net position. And this on top, this is quite important. That top bit, whether we get that top bit depends on whether or not the reprocessing of the material occurs within, in this case, the UK. So why is that important? Well, I'm going to come on to that. We had another study done recently, and it was conducted on behalf of RAP and the Green Alliance, and this looked at jobs under different circular economy scenarios. And these again went beyond the sort of recycling rate scenarios and looked at remanufacturing rates and how different rates of reuse and move towards the product to service models would affect employment generation in the UK. And you can see, I think you can see in this row here, that as you move from the no new initiatives through to current development rate through to a more transformative scenario, the job creation increases really quite significantly. But that's the gross job generation. The study did what I think was something very sensible. It looked at, well, actually we can't necessarily claim that all of these jobs will accrue. We've got some displacement effects and we've got some limits as to how much of the labour force we can actually employ. And so they went and looked at the net jobs created, and that figure, although it's lower, it's still not insignificant. It's another 100,000 people into the labour market. So, some thoughts here then, just in moving to conclusion. We've got some interesting questions around what we get in terms of net job generation. And this applies whether it be reuse, remanufacture, new business models, whatever. In the case of reuse, this is, do I buy a reused product? But what would I have done if I didn't? Would I have bought a new one? Would I not have? Would I have bothered at all to buy anything? Maybe I only bought it because it was there and it was available through the charity shop, and I bought it for that reason. All of these are actually plausible counterfactuals, and we know they are counterfactuals that people would, that they do prevail. So we don't necessarily get all of these jobs. So not all jobs in reuse will be net jobs. We'll have displacement effects. But I think the preparation for reuse offers really significant opportunities for retraining of people in product repair, product remanufacture, and so forth. So they have high value in their own right as projects that bring people back into employment. In their own right, they compare extremely favorably with other forms of training initiative, but they're actually achieving an environmental objective. And we got extraordinarily good evidence of that in the UK. So there's a potential for supporting long-term unemployed people back into work. Another challenge, quality. You'd take ages to guess what material this is. This is glass that's come out of the back end of a sorting facility. And a lot of sorting facilities, what they do is they don't positively sort glass. They positively sort everything else, and they leave the glass as the rest. And this is glass, Enzo will love this, this is glass that's effectively in a maturation bay, because it's got so much organic matter in it, it's composting down. We have a real problem with quality. And this goes back to some of the points I was just asking you to bear in mind earlier. We've got the jobs in recycling, a lot of them are in the reprocessing phase. So if we want those jobs to stay here, what are the things that make it more likely that that will happen? Well, we have relatively high disposal costs in the EU compared to the places where we're often sending this material, China, India, Indonesia. And that means that if you're a plastics recycler, and even after the sorting plant, you've got stuff coming at you that has 30% of material in it that you really didn't want, you have to deal with that. And the cost of dealing with that is not trivial. And so, what does that mean? It means effectively that you're able to fund the export of the material because the export of the material is going to be cheaper than having to deal with the rejects. And that means that it's less likely that the stuff stays within the European Union. And this is a really important point, because it says, if we're going to set higher targets, one of the things we have to do is to make sure that we're getting quality material out, and that it's appropriate to the reprocessing industry. So that Friends of the Earth graphic that showed the employment tickling along the bottom and then leaping up, that wasn't because there was a six-fold increase projected for recycling. I'd endeavour to suggest that's because the stuttering along the baseline was the real level of current jobs, taking into account the fact that we export a lot of this material, whereas the leap up assumed that we weren't exporting any of it and that all the jobs stayed where they are, stayed within the EU. So it's a really important point that we have to bear in mind, that we have to focus on quality to make sure that those jobs stay here. And I think that that quality issue is exactly we've got an interesting case of the more, should we say, the more circular economy type new business models, because if you think about what may be going on with some of those new business models, and if you take on board the point that was made in the previous presentations that we're a massive importer of raw materials, then what actually matters just as much as the number of jobs that we generate through this activity, it's where we generate them. And I think there's an interesting case in some of the more circular business models that we reshore some of the jobs that maybe we maybe are currently in other economies where the primary manufacturing is taking place. We're effectively looking at more of the repair, reuse, remanufacturing, potentially staying closer to home, rather than having a model where, in terms of the economy and the movement of the material, we're in a very broad global circle. We're somehow bringing that circle closer back home. So there's really significant potential for job creation from recycling across the EU. It's around 200,000 direct. Put in the multipliers, it's around 400,000, give or take. But it's susceptible to leakage related to the quality of the stuff that we pull out. We won't get all those jobs if we're pulling out low-quality material and it just gets exported from the European Union. Significant potential, though, on the preparation for reuse side. And I think it's less likely that that's going to suffer from the displacement side, but it's possible. Not all those reuse jobs will be net jobs created, but I think in the round we've got at least similar quantities of jobs that we can generate through making progress on reuse. And I think this is really significant where we are at the moment within the EU and across the EU. There's the potential for retraining and jobs for the long-term unemployed. Last point. Policy will make these things happen if it happens in the right way. The arguments around reuse, it's not that easy to set some EU-wide policy that makes the reuse happen. It is easier at the member state level. It's easier, I would argue. And there are things that can be done to move that position forward and that encourage more of the reuse and the jobs that flow from that to remain in the EU. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for another interesting presentation. Jobs, always very interesting and challenging topic. I'm sure there are some questions that were provoked by this presentation. Tamle, gospod, na sredini.
Koprivnikar Mihael z Kmetijsko-gozdarske zbornice Slovenije. I see you have headphones, so I will speak in Slovene. Reciklaža in ponovna uporaba sta delovno zelo intenzivni panogi in kakor sem se pogovarjal tudi z strokovnjaki podobnimi kot je on, ki se ukvarjajo s tem področjem, so predlagali tudi spremembe na davčnem področju, da bi pospešile dejansko to področje. In sicer, da bi prešli iz obdavčevanja dela na postopoma na obdavčevanje produktov, ki izhajajo iz neobnovljivih virov. Ali mislite, da lahko naredimo dejansko prehod brez tudi spremembe na davčnem področju?
Thanks for your question, and I'm very pleased to respond to it, having just reviewed the situation in terms of environmental fiscal reform across all 28 member states. It's my personal view that we should be looking at fiscal instruments in the longer term to address primary materials. I think that's an important step. It's a 10-year project, in my personal view, because tax harmonisation across the EU is deemed as very, very difficult, and I think we really need to take a lot of people with us if we're going to do this. But I think the benefits of a primary materials tax would be that if you think about fundamentally what in environmental terms we're trying to do with the circular economy, we're trying to maintain materials in the cycle of utility, as it were, for as long as possible. So we're trying not to use new materials. And, you know, fundamentally, it would be a very sensible thing to do materials taxation. Many countries already tax many mineral resources within their borders. They do so at very, very low rates. The highest tax on mineral aggregates is the one in the UK that's £2.50 a tonne. Now, the value of doing this is that we do shift, potentially, we do have a source of revenue that enables us to shift some taxes away from labour and on, onto the environmental goods. It always really hacks me off when you talk to a finance ministry and they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't tax that particular product because we don't know what the externalities are." They say we don't know what the optimal tax is for extraction of primary bauxite or whatever it might be. And you say to them, "Well, what do you think is the optimal tax on labour?" What is the optimal tax on labour? Why are we ought to be trying not to be taxing it at all. We want to have people in employment, don't we? We want them to be useful, and we want people to have fulfilling lives. So I think as a sort of 10-year project, the idea of a raw materials tax is a compelling one. It's consistent with the objectives that we're trying to achieve. It's also, if we end up with things like product passports that have information about the product concerned within them, it enables us to do something called border tax adjustment, which means that the competitiveness issues that often undermine the implementation of new environmental taxes sort of dissolve away, or they should.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have no more time for more questions. Shane, thank you. We are moving forward.